Right. Recording is on formally. So this is the first of the Panchatantra classes. And I'd like to begin by pointing out three terms which will come to you by the by. The first is that there is a difference between oral literature and written literature. Oral literature is that which is transmitted by word of mouth. As you realize, of course, that writing came a lot later. Literature predated writing, and lots of texts were circulated by Shruti and Smriti, right? Shruti and Smriti. So by hearing or speaking and through memory. And remember these terms, Shruti and Smriti, right? So a lot of these texts, for example, were sung very, very often. Early texts, and you will, of course, realize that prose came later on, poetry came first, and a lot of these texts were sung by minstrels, sung at court, for example. Most of the first literatures would be sung at court. There would be an entire tradition of folk literatures, songs sung by the people, and talking about their own stories. In fact, those of you who've read Bengali literature and its history will remember the Mongol Kabbo, right? There have been the earliest Indian epics, for example, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, were all sung, right? Rather than, having a coherent, specific textual body. And therefore, you see what happens in oral literature is that you see every time it is sung in a particular community or a particular place, and because there's no fixed text, oral texts continuously undergo a change. Palte palte cha, right? So therefore, in oral literatures, very often there's no definitive text until and unless it is written down. Look at the Ramayana, for example, and the Mahabharata. There are no definitive texts of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, right? Therefore, this is a characteristic of oral literature. Very often, because it is sung in verse, therefore, there's a rhythm to oral literature. And you'll find in Panchatantra, for example, that there's a component of Panchatantra which delivers the moral, which has a poetic bent to it. It is versification. Right, so there's a mixture of prose and verse, and the tale is told in prose, whilst the moral is told in verse. Right? So this is the tradition of oral literature, and this is true not only of the Panchatantra or of Indian literature in general, but it is also true for all literatures. All literatures across the world were fundamentally and primarily oral literatures. Even Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey were primarily sung, right? They were meant to be performed. Therefore, the orality of literature is something which you should be very, very careful about, right? Because we know that the Panchatantra was written around 200 BCE. In fact, the text that we will read is a text that was transmitted across various centuries. And in 1192 AD, right, so we are talking almost about 1200 and 200, that's 1400 years later on, a Jain monk named Punarbhadra actually wrote down the text. So the text that we have is not, in fact, a text that was very new. I'm sorry, a text that was very old. It was a newer text. And when we talk about the versions of the Panchatantra, we do not have really a primary or an original text that we are talking about. In fact, it's very interesting. We'll talk about this later on. that oral texts often travel from cultures to cultures. As you know, that in South India, for example, there's a different version of the Ramayana in different places. The different versions of the Mahabharata, for example, right? This does not happen with a written text. A written text is almost a sanctified document. You can't change it. There's a question of authorship comes in, right? So when we are talking about the Panchatantra, remember that the Panchatantra traveled, for example, from India to the Middle East. And when I talk about India, this is something which is also very important for you to note, is that we are talking about a subcontinent rather than a country. There was no India with the Kashmir dispute and the borders till Kanyakumari at that point of time. You would include, say, for example, Java, Sumatra, and the others within the Indian subcontinent. The Indian subcontinent in the west would probably extend right up to the Hindu Kush and Afghanistan. In the north, it would almost go up to Tibet. And in the west, in the east, of course, you would have, once again, Burma, Bangladesh, all included within the Indian subcontinent. So when we're talking about a Bharatvarsho in terms of Indian classical literature, it would be a humongous territory. Humongous হচ্ছে বিরাট বড়. It's extraordinarily large, right? A humongous territory. But interestingly, when we're talking about classical literature, we'd like to sort of point out that most of this classical literature would be written in the Sanskrit language. So wherever Sanskritization happened and Sanskrit literature traveled, the Indian classical literatures also traveled. But again, they percolated down to different kinds of regional or folk languages. Texts very often moved from the dialectical languages from the dialects, I'm sorry, not the dialectical languages, the dialects to the Sanskrit texts. Sanskrit texts, like the Panchatantra, often travel to the Middle East, and then to Europe. For example, tales in Chaucer, for example, in English literature, would take off from a text in Panchatantra, for example. So texts travel, narratives travel, because when a traveler comes to another country, he picks up a text, and this he takes with him to his own culture, and that text also travels elsewhere, right? So this is the way in which cultures, texts, narratives, stories especially travel, right? So that is oral literature. Then one, it is spoken, right? Oral literatures can also be folk literatures in the sense that they are spoken by the common people. Oral literature can also be courtly oral literature, right, which is spoken by a more elite kind of a class with the Shabha Kavi or the court poet articulating this oral literature. And therefore, oral literatures have this habit of not being textually stable. I would say these texts change from narrator to narrator, from one place to the other. Things are added, things are subtracted from it, right? So these are some of the characteristics of oral literature. I'm not saying these are exhaustive characteristics, but these are some characteristics. The second thing that you need to know is this concept of the Tantra, right? Now, when you talk about the Panchatantra, obviously you have two components here. You have Pancha, which obviously means 5, and you have the Tantra. And Tantra for you is a kind of an obscure, esoteric practice of certain rituals. No, Tantra in the original Sanskrit would mean anything which is a text, theory, system, method, or practice. So a text, theory, system, method. Therefore, Tantra would be in the nature of a learned discourse. Discourse in the sense that it is spoken or uttered or written down and transmitted. Right? Therefore, so 5 learned discourses is what the Panchatantra is all about. Right? This I needed to clarify before I entered the text. The third thing that, of course, all of you, the third term that all of you should know is this concept of the fable. Most of you have read fables. Aesop, for example, was one of the first proponents of the fable. Right? Now, you've read it at Aesop's Golpo, but remember that the fable has 2 components. One is the story, and the fable is normally a short story. It's a very short, succinct, very brief tale. Fables are not very longish narratives. Right? But the fable is marked by the presence of a moral at the end of the story. Very often this moral is told in one pithy saying. Pithy is P-I-T-H-E-E, very curt saying. For example, fools rush in where angels fear to tread is a pithy saying, right? Or waste not, want not, right? These are pithy saying, very succinct morals which are delivered through the story. So the story is a kind of what we will call an exemplar, E-X-E-M-P-L-A-R, or an example, in the sense that it illustrates, it exists primarily to codify or to illustrate the moral. So what is more important? The moral is more important. The story is an adjunct. It just merely highlights the moral. Right? So this is what the fable is about. A tale with a moral. Now, there's another kind of a religious tale or a moral tale, for example. Moral in the sense that it pertains specifically to religious or ethical teaching. These are called parables. Parables very often deliver religious and moral teachings. But there's one important distinction between the parable and the fable, which I'll come to by the by. Now, for example, you often have Jesus's parables. Jesus taught his disciples with a few parables, right? For example, once there's this story about Jesus traveling and they see people stoning a woman, right? Throwing stones at a woman and trying to kill her. And Jesus asks, who is this woman and why are you stoning him? And they say she's a loose woman, she's immoral, she's committed sin, and therefore we are stoning her to death. And then Jesus says, well, okay, fine. So the first stone should be thrown by the man who has committed no sin. And they all disperse. The moral being that all of us are sinners and we should not judge each other. Now, the other person whom all of you are aware of, who talks in the parable, in the sense of the parable, is Ramakrishna. Right? For example, the Kathamrita. Now, Ramakrishna's teachings are all through fables. Those of you who have this book by Srima, who was a disciple of Ramakrishna, will remember the story about the snake, which Ramakrishna often used to talk about. And the snake becomes extremely docile when he hears the sadhu saying that you should be non-violent. And the sadhu finds that he's almost beaten to death. And the sadhu says, well, I told you not to bite, but I didn't tell you not to raise your hood. Right? So, it's a way in which certain moral religious teachings are told in terms of small tales which illustrate them. So the tale and the moral are, as it were, in a kind of a bind. You see, a kind of an attachment. And the primary importance of the tale is only to illustrate the moral. So the moral is more important, right? Now, a parable is different from a fable in the sense that the fable very often uses animals along with humans, or it may just be about animals. If it is just about animals, it's called a beast fable, right? Those of you who will read Chaucer, all of you will, in fact, next semester, you will start with Chaucer. Chaucer has this collection of tales called the Canterbury Tales. See, 29 pilgrims are going to Canterbury Cathedral, and everyone decides that everyone will tell a story. Right? And there's the nun's priest who tells a story about a clever fox called Renard, I'm sorry. The fox is called Renard, and the cock, which is very proud about his voice, is called Chanakya. That is a beast fable where the characters are all animals. But remember something, that the beast fable is used primarily because of two reasons. One is that primitive or primary societies had much closer interaction between the human and the animal, right? So we lived amongst nature, so animals were a part of your daily life, right? Of course, now that doesn't happen. Still in Shantiniketan, you'll find, a lot of animals, but when people start living in the city, animals, you go to the zoo to see the animals. So the animal and the human world are, as it were, separated. But in primitive societies, that did not take place. And therefore, certain animals would be imbued with certain cultural values. For example, the cow is sacred to us. There are certain animals which are given, attributes of intelligence, for example. The fox in all cultures is the intelligent animal. The crow, for example, is the intelligent bird. And you will see, for example, that in certain cases, in certain cultures, certain animals are considered very holy. For example, the cat, for Egyptians, is considered very holy, right? Therefore, animals have certain value systems or certain human attributes given to them in the beast fable. And these values or attributes are culture specific. Also important here to note is that we are not really talking about the animals here, even though they are characters, right? We are actually talking about human societies, human personalities, right? So the beast fable is a point of entry into certain human attributes and cultures. But the parable, remember that the fable can use beasts, the parable will almost never use the beast. So the parable is a much more human kind of text, human kind of a tale, whereas the fable can incorporate beasts. If it does, it becomes a beast fable. It can often use the human and the animal, right? Say, for example, Garur, being used in the Ramayana, for example, or Nol Damayanti, where, you see the close coexistence of the human and the animal. Shonar Horin, the golden deer in Sita's tale, for example, would be an example where the animal and the human would coexist together, right? So these are some of the facts that we'll come to when we critically discuss Panchatantra. But you will please remember that when Panchatantra is using texts or using animals, they are in reality talking about human characters rather than animals. per se, as such. The other thing that I would like to remind you before we go into a discussion of Panchatantra and we enter into the reason why the text was written, when the text was written, where are the places, is that, comes the fundamental question: why does one read literature? And this is a question which you will not answer today to me, or I will not provide a straight answer, because, this is a question which has plagued people all across generations. There are two motivations apparently for studying literature. One is that it pleases you. Most of you said in your last interaction that from childhood you had pleasure in literature. So what is the pleasure that literature gives? Is it the pleasure of listening to a particular line? Or is it some knowledge that you seek from literature? This is a question, isn't it? Do you read literature to learn something, a moral, say, for example, the Panchatantra, specifically a moral literature, where the tale exists not to please you, but to deliver the moral? Or say, for example, if you read something by Shelley, right? Let's say Burns. Burns has this very beautiful line called, "My love is like a red, red rose that blossoms forth in June." Are you reading that for the pleasure? Are you reading it for the beauty of the line? So there is one axis of literature which says that literature is all about knowledge, giving you awareness, specifically teaching you. This literature is pedagogic, Pedagogic, tuned towards utility. Right? The sermon, the parable, the fable are all geared towards giving you knowledge. On the other hand, you have another axis. Think of the graph, for example, the x-axis and the y-axis, or rather, y-axis and the x-axis. My orientations got a little confused there. There's another axis of pleasure, beauty. You read literature because it is the beauty of human truth which is expressed in the most beautiful possible way. Keats once said that a line of poetry should be, should take enormous amounts of time, yet when you read it, if it doesn't appear to be a moment's construction, it is not really valid. Say, for example, Shelley's poem, he's writing The Skylark, and he talks about human desire, and he says these lines, for example: "We look before and aft and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that sing of saddest thought." You see, why is that line so beautiful to us? Is it because Shelley is delivering a moral? No. Or is it because of the beauty and the felicity of that expression? You see, my teacher at Presidency College very often used to talk about King Lear. King Lear has lost his daughter and is asking when shall he find another when shall he hold his daughter once again? And he utters 5 nevers. You could say never, 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 never. And you could say this in different tones in the way that Lear suddenly asks, never? And that comes the answer, never. And then comes the father's, almost tragic realization, never. Right. So my point being, you see, we can read literature for knowledge. we can equally read literature for pleasure. Now, this thesis was given by, or very succinctly expressed, by a classical satirist and critic called Horace, Horace. I want you to take that name down, Horace. And Horace wrote about two concepts of literature. He said that literature can talk about utile, U-T-I-L-E. Utile being utility. That is the moral. That is its usage. Literature can also talk about dulce, D-U-L-C-E, delight and beauty. So utile, utility, dulce, D-U-L-C-E, delight and beauty. Literature moves around these axes. So there are some literatures which are specifically directed towards the delivery of a certain message. There are certain literatures which are specifically directed towards just creating a sense of beauty. And very often literatures sort of mingle both. Horace said that literature should instruct while pleasing. That means the instruction is more important than the pleasure. And that, I think, is also true about the Panchatantra, because specifically the text is an educative text. At the same time, please remember that delight and beauty is the realm of the imagination, right? Imagination of the poet. And when you imagine, say, the hare talking to the elephants, or the snake and the Brahmin talking together, you are liberating your imagination. A very crucial text which I could talk about very, very easily, something which you all have read, Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver going to the land of the Lilliputs. And you remember, the Lilliputs all climbing onto Gulliver's body and feeling that he's a man mountain, as it were. And there are small loaves of bread that they bring to him. So literature uses the scope of the human imagination, but then it can also deliver its morals. And that is, as a text, what Panchatantra seeks to do. So why did the Panchatantra come about? Who wrote it is now the issue that I would like to talk about very briefly. Before we sort of conclude today's class, we'd like to set a few things together. Is how does and who was this sage called Vishnu Sharma? Now, if you've read the introduction to the text already, you will realize that the Panchatantra is talking about a land where there is a king, and the king has 3 sons. And these sons are all worthless. They live a life of pleasure, and they do not do any kind of activity at all, right? And therefore, to teach them, the king is at his wit's end. And he says anybody who can teach them properly is going to be rewarded by me. And people advise him that it takes 12 years to teach children. It takes so much time to teach grammar. And the king says, I don't have so much time. And therefore, as per the advice of one of his ministers, he goes to a certain person called Vishnu Sharma, who's 80 years old. He's offered land and he reclines and he says, I don't have any inclination towards any moral or any riches, but I will teach them what I have to teach in 6 months, or else, you can wag your bottom at me. This is what he calls the lion roar. So very obviously, this is a text which is trying to teach princes. But what is the education that it wants to give? It's an education in practical life. It's also an education in Rajniti. You see, there's this particular kind of manual which is called the mirror for magistrates, or the mirror for kings, the manual for rulers. The most celebrated Indian example of this is something which you know. It is Chanakya's Arthashastra, right? Now, Arthashastra is a manual specifically written for kings on how to govern and how to live a life and defeat enemies and talk about people's warfare, right? I'm sorry, talk about people's welfare, not warfare. I'm very sorry, welfare. The other thing which of course, probably some of you may know is Machiavelli. Machiavelli, not the Indian version, but the Italian version is Machiavelli's The Prince. What must the prince do? Or, for example, Castiglione's The Courtier. So these are manuals which are written for kings. One of the other Chinese ones many of you might have realized is The Art of War by Sun Tzu, right? Now, these are specifically written for kings. So apparently what we can see here is that, the text was specifically written for the children of the kings, the three sons, so that they could govern their land after their father. So it was a manual for princes. It was a mirror for magistrates. But we need to also understand that the Panchatantra is not merely about kings. It also talks about the life of the ordinary people. In fact, most of the characters, the animal fables that are used, the human beings who are talked about in the Panchatantra belong to different classes. Therefore, the Panchatantra is also about the teaching of niti, right? Correct, ethical, practical behavior. How does one live life correctly, and how does one live life comfortably, right? So these are certain things which the Panchatantra talks about, not only for kings. Kakolokiyam, the chapter that we will deal with, is specifically for kings, right? It's very specifically a part which is directed towards the education of the kings. But the rest of the texts very often use tales directed towards the common people so that they can live life properly. And when we mean properly, niti is not always equivalent to, dharma. When you are following dharma, ethical action, you are absolutely clear that to say a lie is a sin, right? The Panchatantra does not say that. The Panchatantra says, if you lie, and if you lie strategically to save your own life, then that lie is permissible. So you see, when we talk about a morality in Panchatantra, it's a morality of practical life. How you can live and how you can flourish. Well, that's not sin, but you can lie only to save your life. Take an example. there's this last part of the Panchatantra where there's this tale between the crocodile and the monkey. And the crocodile becomes friends with the monkey, but the crocodile's wife says, I want to eat the heart of the monkey. And the crocodile therefore invites the monkey, carries him on its back in the mid-sea. He tells him, I want to, I'm taking you there because my wife wants to eat your liver. And the monkey says, oh, but I've left my liver on the tree. I'm not carrying it with me. And the crocodile says, so what can be done? He says, take me back. I'll collect my liver and come with you. If your wife has wanted to eat my liver, she'll have it. And the monkey travels. Crocodile, being foolish, it travels back, and the monkey jumps on the trees and says, I lied to you, but you should not have friends like the crocodile. The point remaining, you see, deceit, cunning, intelligence, lying may be strategic, and it may be important for survival. So the Panchatantra does not talk about what is dharma or adharma. The Panchatantra talks about fundamentally the ways in which human beings can coexist peacefully and survive themselves. And it also talks about how the king can destroy people, or king can destroy others, enemies, by adopting falsehood, cunning, etc. And Kakulakiyam is a text that will deal with deceit and cunning. In fact, the owls are destroyed by betrayal rather than, fighting with the crows. So we will discuss these questions. These are very tricky ethical questions. What is the niti? In Rajniti, you have this saying, everything's fair in love and war. So when we are talking about niti, what niti are we talking about? Anyways, I digress. Let me focus a little bit on who was Vishnu Sharma. Vishnu Sharma is seen only in the preamble to the Panchatantra. He exists nowhere else in the text, right? So was Vishnu Sharma a real person? He might be. He might have been. Equally, he might not have been. He might have been a fictional character as well. Some critics have suggested that Vishnu Sharma was actually another name for Chanakya, and that while Chanakya was writing Arthashastra, he could equally have written the Panchatantra. Take the figure of Vyasa, for example. You do not know whether Vyasa exists. Vyashdev. All of us know that Vyashdev wrote the Mahabharata. The Vyashdev might have written a part of Mahabharata. He might have existed. He might not have existed at all. Right? So what I'm trying to suggest here is, while we say, you will reply, yes, I know who wrote Panchatantra. Vishnu Sharma wrote it. But who was Vishnu Sharma? We actually have no idea, right? We know that Vishnu Sharma lived in Mailapura. The name of the story is, the name of the place is given as it were. Even where that place is very difficult to say. It has been identified in Tamil Nadu. There are a lot of texts which talk about down south. There are a lot of texts which equally talk about Pataliputra. And there's a lot of texts which talk about the land of the apples. So it might be Kashmir. In fact, there's a strong suggestion that the Panchatantra was written from Kashmir. Right? But there's a problem, you see, that, Panchatantra does not talk about one place or one time. It talks about once upon a time in a certain place. So everything about time and place of the Panchatantra is vague. Just as in oral literature, we do not know where the tales originated from. It might have been 3 tales initially and then gathered momentum as they spread. It might have been a collection of tales which kept on growing as more and more people sort of were brought in the ambit of narrating it. Right. So the question is, or rather the answer is, that we are not very sure. But I have given you, and this I'll send you, is my observations on Panchatantra. What do we know about Vishnu Sharma? He's 80 years of age, has no worldly desires and concerns, and he will teach. He's a supreme teacher, and he will teach the princes the way of conduct in 6 months so that they become experts in the art of government. And then he fades away. Right. So he might be purely a narrative invention. There might be no character called Vishnu Sharma at all. It's just part of the text. Vishnu Sharma might have been the name of the storyteller and the author who had the imagination and the artistry to first shape a floating body of tales. Right. So, you see, these tales, they might have already existed before Vishnu Sharma. They certainly did. So what Vishnu Sharma was doing was bringing them together in one body. This might be one possibility. He was a storyteller who was bringing together these tales and giving them a structure. He was giving them a structure, an artistic whole with complex and unique structure. And what is that structure is something we'll look at in a moment. And therefore, all the other storytellers before him might have, their names might have been subsumed under this one name called Vishnu Sharma. So possibility number one is Vishnu Sharma did exist. He collected all these tales and he told them in a particular way, which was carried from generation to generation. This might have been one possibility. And this also happened with Vashdev also. You see, Vashdev might have been a real storyteller, and he might have collected the stories of the Mahabharata into one coherent body of narrative. Equally, the other possibility is that Vishnu Sharma was a purely fictional character, and that there is, you remember, somebody who tells the story of Vishnu Sharma at the beginning of the text. So there is an anonymous is whose name is not given, anonymous narrator who tells the story of Vishnu Sharma, right, in the preamble. Try and understand this. Vishnu Sharma narrates the story of the 5 tantras. Somebody narrates the story of Vishnu Sharma. So we have multiple narrators within the text. And that this narrator was actually the storyteller of Panchatantra, and Vishnu Sharma was a character who was invented by him. So Vishnu Sharma is a story just like the other fables. This might be a possibility also. Who this anonymous narrator was, we shall never know. Why am I repeating this over and over again? Tomodder eta mone hote pare je lokta, why is he repeating and continuously telling us this? He's telling you this because we are looking at this question about authorship, right? Who is the author of an oral text is something we are never quite sure about. So there's this gray zone about the identity of Panchatantra altogether. Right. Now, why has this question about Chanakya come in? You see, the names Vishnugupta and Vishnu Sharma were associated with Chanakya, the author of the a text which is specifically prescriptive. Prescriptive money. It tells the Raja what to do. Right? Who are the people you avoid? What is the correct course of action? Why should you take spies, for example? That is the Arthashastra. But the Panchatantra does not do that. The Panchatantra tells you the way of living life, not only governing people, but also living life. Therefore, the Panchatantra is part of the Niti Shastra. So we are distinguishing between the Arthashastra, which is specifically political, economical, socio, let's say, it talks about the political economy of the nation, and the Niti Shastra, which talks about practical, ethical behavior in life. Niti Shastra. But there's no proof that Vishnugupta Chanakya, the author of the Arthashastra, also wrote the Panchatantra. Right? So the name might actually be symbolic, is an author persona, is a facade, an author persona who is like Vyas or Bharat Muni who wrote Natya Shastra. He might just be a kind of a invention, a name which was invented, through whom these texts were told. No one knows, for example, who carved or who painted on the Ajanta walls, and therefore Vishnusharma might equally be an anonymous narrator. Okay, so what are the places and locations that are given in the Panchatantra, and what is the date? Approximately, Indologists have suggested that it might have been 200 BCE, although I suggest that the tales were existent much earlier. And Mahila Ropia, the text that talks about, might be the southern lands. It might have also originated from Kashmir. There are places which are mentioned here in the text. Pataliputra is Patna. Vardhaman might be Bardhaman of our Bardhaman. Kosala might be in Uttar Pradesh. But again, you see, we are not sure, because these names might just be specific tales which have originated from certain specific locations. But what the Panchatantra gives us is an idea that, there was this subcontinent called Bharatvarsha, where, well, not Bharatvarsha really at that point of time. Now it's loaded with all political connotations, but there was the sense of a subcontinent where people had interfaces through trade and commerce and travel, and that within this culture, texts traveled, leapt from one state to another, from one part of the country to another, and became, sort of, or rather was absorbed into certain bodies of texts. So the epics that we have, the Panchatantra that we have, gives us a sense that the subcontinent, very often people interfaced and their narratives got interlaced, that they were absorbed and created into certain coherent texts. But, as I pointed out, in many cases, in the Panchatantra, stories are set in very abstract places. For example, in a certain wood, in a certain settlement, by a certain pool. Obviously, we're also talking about animals. So many of these stories are written as sort of set in forests, right? Anonymous forests, just like the anonymous author. So there's a degree of anonymity in the authorship of Panchatantra, in the location of Panchatantra, even in the dating of Panchatantra. Right, you must be thinking I'm mad, really. What I'm basically telling is, I don't know. or we don't know exactly who wrote Panchatantra, when it was written, or what were the places. Now, why, therefore, am I talking about Punarbhadra? Punarbhadra had a written text. He wrote the Panchatantra down in AD 1199, so around 1200 AD. Remember, we talked about 200 BCE, and we're talking about 1199 AD. So we are actually talking about a span of 1400 years. And we have this date only because Punarbhadra Suri, Suri being a guru in Jain, states his own name and his patron in the colophon of the text. He's writing his name down and the date down in the available written text of the Panchatantra, based on which we have these translations. So the first real text that we have is 1200, where it is written down. It has been transformed from an oral text into a written specific text. Now, quickly before I end today's class, what is the structure of the Panchatantra? What are the 5 tales of the Panchatantra? These are the main tales, remember, and there are interlaced tales. Incidentally, I should also talk about, very briefly tell you that the term used for short narratives in the Indian subcontinent in Sanskrit was Akhan, right? So Panchatantra is also about the Akhan. You will have these terms thrown at you in times when you are doing your references. So what are the 5 tantras, 5 main tales, within which there are other tales? So this has a Chinese box structure or Russian doll. When you were young, I'm sure many of you played with wooden dolls. Kather putul paoya jeto na? Ekta putuler moddhe arekta putul. There was one doll, within that another doll, within that doll another doll. So as you open the doll, further smaller dolls emerge. This is what is called a Russian doll, right? So within the Panchatantra, there is a main text of Vishnusharma. Then there is a text of the 5 tantras. Within these 5 tantras, there are other tales as well. Within that other tale remains one more tale. So it has a very complex Russian doll-like structure. I'll show this to you when we do Kakulukiam. In fact, Kakulukiam has a total of 18 tales. And I'll show you which tale is narrated by whom and to what end. But before that, the 5 texts are Mitra Bheda, or the loss of friends, or dissension among allies. Mitra is friend, Bheda is separation, loss of friends. This is a tale about a lion and a bull. This bull is left for dead by the merchant. The lion makes friends with him, and there are 2 jackals who want to be the courtiers of the lion, but the bull becomes the lion's friend, and the jackals hatch an elaborate plan through which the lion and the bull are separated. So, loss of friends. The second is Mitra Labha. So, the first is Mitra Bheda. The second is Mitra Labha, or gaining of friends, winning of friends. Now, you see, there are 2 different notions on securing allies, for example. For a king, he's not talking about friends. He's also talking about allies, other kings who will be, with him when he governs the kingdom. And this is the story of a crow, mouse, turtle, and a deer who together defeat a hunter, right? Who together defeat a hunter. Therefore, the question is, if smaller creatures or smaller people can come together, they can defeat a more powerful enemy. See, there's a political angle to all these texts, right? So if you lose trust in your allies, you will be politically weaker. If you can make political allies, you will be stronger. Then comes the story which we will read, Kak Ulukiyam. As I said yesterday, Kak, crow, Uluk is the owl. So on crows and owls, Oliver's translation is on war and peace. The question is, the owls are more powerful than the crows. What do the crows do? Do they make friends with the owls? They won't. Do they flee away to the mountains? Do they live their own residence? Do they fight back? If they fight back, how can a lesser enemy fight a greater enemy? That's the question that Kakulukiyam asks. The next story is Labdha Pranasam. Now, remember, this is loss of gains made. Labdha is gaining, and pranasam is wasting. So whatever you have gained, you have wasted. Loss of gains and losing what you have gained. This is the story of the monkey and the crocodile that I said. You know, the monkey gains a friend. The crocodile gains a friend and he loses it. Labdha pranasam. And finally, there's the fifth book, which is called Apariksatakaram, which is specifically ill-concerned action, on hasty actions. Now, the first four books tell you what to do. The fifth book, actually, the fifth Tantra, actually is a loser collection of tales, which tell you what not to do, right? What should people avoid in the course of their actions? Right, so these are the 5 books of the Panchatantra: loss of friends, winning of friends, crows and owls, loss of gains, ill-concerned action. Every single book or every single Tantra has multiple stories attached to it, and they are being told by this greater structure of Vishnusharma, who is talking to the princes. So Kakulukiyam, for example, will have a Chinese box and a Russian doll structure, right? We'll have a broader narrative, smaller narratives, even smaller narratives, right? There's one small thing which I want you to note before I bring this class, my part of this class, to a close, is that there is a mixture of prose and verse. The main narrative is in prose. Right? So the story is in prose, but wherever there is a moral caveat, wherever there is a moral which is delivered, a moral message, the verse form is used. So not only is the structure complex, but also the verse and the prose interact with each other, and language itself in the Panchatantra is complex. Now, I have invited, therefore, at the end of the course, I will invite a professor in Sanskrit who will give you a feel of the language. You see, we're all reading translations. It's important to understand how the Sanskrit text functioned. So she will probably give you a few of these lessons in Sanskrit so that you can understand how the language functions. But then that is for another day. I think that is, enough for today. I don't want to rattle your brains too much. What I have covered is the oral tradition. I've covered what a tantra is. I have talked about the fable. I've talked about the parable and its distinction with the fable. I have talked about who Vishnu Sharma was, why Panchatantra was written, what is the tentative dating of Panchatantra, what are the problems of authorship of Panchatantra, and what are the 5 books of the Panchatantra. This is the ground that I have covered. Remember, this is a ground I'll cover again and again, come back to these questions. but that will be in a subsequent class. With that, I would like to bring the recording part of the class to a close, and I will, once the